All right, brothers, inshallah, we're going to get started. We're just going to do a quick volume check. Is the volume okay? And inshallah, we can begin. And sisters, please, if you can just kind of keep the kids quiet, it'd be great. So first of all, assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and jazakallah khair for everyone for attending the session today. As the brother mentioned, this is sort of our weekly Friday session in which we want to cover relevant topics, things that are going on in the community, the ummah, and obviously, things that are part of our deen. And as we proceed, as the brother kind of mentioned, right, the topic for today is something a little special. It's a bit wordy, but just kind of follow it with me. So today's topic is a journey around the world. And this is going to be a live discussion on Islam, on culture, on the concept of Hijra, activism, and finally sort of raising our kids. And it is definitely a mouthful, and it is definitely a lot of things to cover. But inshallah, we can sort of get into it. And before we do so, I want to just sort of introduce our panel for today. So to my left, we have Brother Irfan Shahid. He is a resident of Chicago for over 40 years. He is a father of 3 daughters. He has traveled around the Muslim world. He began studying Islam in India at Nadwa. He is a frequent contributor to the Muslim Minds podcast, Masjid Talks, and in the Khatib in the Chicago community, and works with both Islamic charities and institutes. And to my far left, Hamda joining us, from across the sea is Brother Burhan Hanif, also known as Abu Yusuf. And Brother Burhan is a graduate in the UK with a degree in politics and a master's in transport planning. He is currently working in the airline industry. He has been invited to lecture on different Islamic subjects internationally, and currently runs online sessions on the Introduction to Islam and Introduction to Usul al-Fiqh. And there's a lot to kind of go over there, but I'm just going to kind of summarize it with that. And to my panelists, jazakallah khair for attending today, and assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Before we jump in, would you brothers like to share anything additional, perhaps about yourself or anything?
No, I'm fine. No, jazakallah.
Okay. I forgot to mention, Brother Abu Yusuf is the heaviest on the table with mashallah 7 kids, and so definitely can give us a lot of practical advice, inshallah. So the topic for today is really traveling around the world as Muslims, right? And as an ummah. But where we want to start our journey today is actually closer to home. And as I'm sure you guys are all aware, there's something that's really kind of burning, in our community, in the Muslim community. And that focus is in Dearborn, in particular. As I'm sure you guys are aware, right? There's been a lot of sort of protests recently. Muslim parents, people who care about their children, Muslim community, and particularly on the subject of protesting, the inclusion of, the LGBTQ agenda, publications, literature upon our youth. And it's a scene we don't see much. And brothers, are you guys aware of the situation? Have you heard about it?
Assalamu alaikum.
Technical. Okay, let's make sure that. Inshallah.
Thank you all for coming. I think we're going to keep it casual today. Can you raise your voice? Yeah. Can you hear me, Michelle? Okay. Yeah, so really hot topic right now with the events that unfolded last night in Dearborn. Very sad. My thoughts and prayers go to all those parents that stood up righteously as a community, as Muslims, enjoying the good, forbidding the evil. They're just trying to protect their families, and they're trying to protect their kids, and they were met with the very rude Stonewall as if they're criminals. They were portrayed as criminals on the news and the national news, and demonized further. It's one blow that you take to you're putting your kids in the trust of this education system, And now their identities, their orientation is being dictated to them. And if for you to try to protect their kids and do the responsible thing by going to the board and by joining the community discussion and letting your voice, letting your voice be heard, you're going to be demonized, ostracized, and criminalized, and portrayed in this manner all over the nation as somebody who's intolerant of these really general human emotions like love and tolerance. That these words that are associated with really, everybody's, every community in the world. Love is just a really general word, and tolerance. So yeah, they took a double hit, and it's our job to really support them and let them know that we're here for them and we got their backs, and we're gonna make it through this as a community.
So Hamza, I think you kind of mentioned a lot, something very interesting, and that is your voice. And I want to kind of ask you guys a question, but before that, I just want to share something slightly personal. For me personally, Dearborn is in a lot of ways a city that's close to my heart. I lived there for a couple of years, and it was in sort of a very amazing community. And I've lived in other parts of the U.S., but Dearborn is very, very special in the sense that you go out and you're walking in the streets, and mashallah, you see people wearing full hijab, you see brothers, you see sisters, and you see a Muslim community that you don't see in the rest of the country really. And as far as I know, it's the most densely populated Muslim community in the United States. As far as I know, a lot of Yemeni brothers there, Lebanese, etc. So there was one thing that really stood out to me as I was watching this news unfold, and it was a sign, a sign that one of the protesters said, and in it he stated the following: that if democracy matters, we're the majority. Referring to their community, the Muslim community. And so I want to really impress Brother Yusuf. Maybe you can perhaps address this. If the Muslims are the majority, why are there voices not being heard in that particular community?
Okay, Jazakallah khair. Just listening to the introduction, obviously it's very localized in terms of the example and the issue, but probably just 3 points to cover. One is that this issue is not unique to the Deoband community. It's a reality actually globally and around the world. That's point number one. So discussing it not just within a local context, but in a West context, actually it's a universal international context. So these issues that we're suffering and we're dealing with in the world related to Chicago, to the US, are the same kind of issues, by the way, are emerging, unfortunately, also across the Muslim world. So if you recognize it's not as if it's an issue that's local to this community, it's actually something which is an international issue that we need to address. And what immediately came to mind when it was raised as a subject, the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when it says, "Yati ala nas zaman as-sabr fihim ala dinhi kal-kabir al-jamr," that there will come a time when holding on to Islam will be like holding on to a hot coal of fire. And we see increasingly the kind of difficulties that are engulfing the ummah. And this is just another example. And I think what we need to think about in this aspect is why, as Muslims, we are always trying to chase and resolve a symptom or an issue, when the reality is we're trying to stop one fire and another fire starts. We're trying to stop that fire and another fire starts. We realize there's so many fires we're trying to deal with. Maybe we just need to take a step back and look at it more broadly and understand, is there an underlying issue that we need to address as a Muslim, as a family, as a community, as an ummah, in tackling this and all the other issues that we talk about? That's just an initial starting point. Secondly, regarding the issue itself, I think you quoted this notion that if democracy matters with the majority. I think we just need to think and take one step back again. What came to my mind is the example of the campaign that was initiated in France by the Muslims as a result of the banning of the hijab. And their argument was very similar, which is our right, which is enshrined within the constitution. And therefore, if it's a right, then we have a right to wear the hijab. this argument is a very problematic argument because it works flip side as well. That if this is a right to wear the hijab, by right, it's also a right not to wear the hijab. Because the argument is predicated upon a principle which is not couched within Islam. So it effectively is borrowing another argument, another premise to legitimize what we do. So democracy is the majority, and if the majority counts, then the majority decides to do something other than Islam, then we're compelled to accept it because it's the majority that matters. Whereas from Islam, what matters is qala Allah, qala Rasul. Whatever Allah says, whatever the Prophet says, it's not based upon majority or minority, it's based upon what is the haqq, and the haqq is what is enshrined within Islam. I think we've just got to be very cognizant of that, and how we articulate an issue must be very different, which is, hey, according to your principles, this is what we have a right to. That is not the basis by which we decide what we do as Muslims. Rather, what we do is according to what Islam tells us. So we're there just to expose the hypocrisy or the irony or the contradiction of their values, but we don't use it as a basis to justify why we do what we do. And I think that's what we need to consider.
Yeah, and if you don't mind me interjecting right there, I think you kind of really hit the nail on the head in terms of the hypocrisy, right? Because, I mean, we're talking about a community, for example, that the majority of them, or a large bulk of them are Muslims. The students are Muslims. They have their values, and it seems like, the rules of the majority, even like the game, so to speak, that it's very selective, right? So it's like, it's when someone wants to go against Islam, it's like, their rights are protected, but when you want to protect your own children, it's like, you really can't. Or so it seems that, and
no, for sure. And I think we as Muslim and as a Muslim community need to be at the forefront of discussing, exposing these contradictions and the hypocrisy. But flip side also, that we also recognize that isn't the basis by what we decide to do as a community. Mm-hmm. And we just need to be able to be cognizant of how we navigate through these very sensitive issues, which has a deep impact upon not just us today. Keep in mind, what happens today has a huge impact upon the generation which comes tomorrow. So whatever we take today, however we decide the direction that we need to take, has a huge impact upon how the next generation views what we do in terms of their own standards, their own criteria, and what they decide to follow on with.
The point that Brother Burhan was addressing, what is the basis you make your judgment on? What is the basis that you object to the curriculum on? And that basis is Quran and Sunnah. And there's another phenomenal example of this that took place in Canada. One of the universities in Ontario had published a poster that depicted a Muslim-looking man kissing another man, and it depicted two Muslim-looking sisters in hijab engaging in lustful, sinful behavior, and the Muslim community objected to that poster, but they didn't object to. They created a change.org petition. They got signatures, and the university pulled the poster down. But the objection that they had to file could not be that we find this reprehensible from our aqidah, from what we believe. They had to file it under the pretext that it is cultural appropriation and politicizing us when we don't want to be politicized.
So if I can again interject a little bit, right? So I mean, alhamdulillah, I think Abu Yusuf and Brother, for everything you're saying makes sense, right? On paper, it definitely makes sense. But I mean, practically speaking, look, like Muslims are in a tough spot, and one of the points in particular, Abu Yusuf, that you started mentioning was that Muslims need to be at the forefront of this. And as we look at the incident in Dearborn, at least from my memory, right, and perhaps some of the elders and brothers have a longer memory, but it's sort of the first time I'm personally seeing Muslims protest in mass to a particular issue, based on their deed in the country. So what I'm trying to ask is, practically, what does leadership look like? What does leadership look like in terms of ideas, and what does leadership look like in terms of actually upholding Islam, like in the West?
So again, there's a couple of points there. One is that as a Muslim community, we can't be silent upon these issues, for sure. These issues are issues which have a huge impact upon how we live, how we identify, how we decide to engage, how we interact. So as Muslims, we don't work on two extremes. We don't isolate, but we neither integrate. But always the presentation in our life has been one of these two. That's the only options is presented to us. We either integrate and assimilate, or we need to isolate. No, we don't. Neither one of these is an acceptable principle for us as Muslims. We need to interact, and we need to interact based upon our values, our principles, and that requires for us to have a voice. But this voice then needs to be premised upon something. There's a very nice saying I heard some time back, which is, we stand upon Islam and Islam alone. And therefore, whatever we do in terms of our interaction and an engagement is based upon Islam. And that is what gives us value. That is what gives us dignity. And that is what gives us honor and respect. Because at the end of the day, what matters, trust on a fundamental basis, is how we have to meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala yawm al-qiyamah, and what basis we met Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So no matter what we try to do to protect our community, which we must do, and we must be at the forefront to seek to protect our community, it must be based upon a leadership that's referring to Islam as a foundation. And when we talk about the hardship, the question is one of an analogy or an example. There's no more difficult reality that we can think about than Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in Mecca. 13 years of struggle, 13 years of oppression, 13 years of seeing the most beloved around him being tortured, going through economic and social boycott. And inshallah, may none of us go through these kind of issues and difficulties.
Inshallah.
But when we talk about what do we need to do, well, the example is in the example of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We persevere, and the way we persevere is by holding on to our principles and our foundation. Life isn't supposed to be easy. We would love for life to be a bed of roses, but it's not. Every single day, as an individual, as a family, as a community, we have challenges, whether living in the East or living in the West. The question is how we respond to these issues. And that is what defines and makes us who we are. And the only basis we have is Quran and Sunnah. So we want to define about leadership. One is our leadership needs to be political, meaning we need to be aware about what is going on a local context, but as well as a national, international context, because these issues are not new. So leadership needs to be aware politically, but also in terms of its engagement, it needs to understand that when we engage, it needs to be it's not a top-down approach. We need to look upwards in terms of who is dictating or pushing this agenda and how we need to respond. But we also need to look beneath us in terms of our community, how we need to connect the dots together in order to give a direction. And the one who should support this, by the way, should be the leaders in our local community. And that is our respected imams. That's our respective committees of the masajid who take on the responsibility to provide these services to our community. They should also be at the forefront of this interaction and discussion.
Okay. So I got two thoughts on that. For the first thought was that this is actually the prescribed method, the interaction that Brother Burhan was talking about, that this is what we want to do as a community. This is the prescribed method in the Quran that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us how to engage as a community, where we warn and we invite. You know, we have that in Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's example, where he would warn and invite, and that is a part of dawah to Islam in and of itself. So when we look at what is the mode of engagement, what is the style of engagement and interaction, it is to warn and invite Bashir wa Nadira. So give the glad tidings of Jannah, and warn of the accountability that everybody will be held to on the Day of Judgment. That was the first thought. Jazakallah khair to Brother Burhan. The second thought was that as a community, there's a synchronous nature to this, that absolutely we have to do this as a community, politically aware on the basis of Iman and the Aqidah. We have to do it within our own families, right? We have to break those barriers that that you would find taboo. I have 3 daughters. This is uncomfortable material to talk about. But, one of my beautiful teachers who's in the audience, he said something profound once. He said, who spends the most time with their children? You think it's you think it's the TV. It's not, it's the system. It's the system that's spending the most time with your children. So you have a window of opportunity in the evening as a father and as a mother to give dawah to your children and to defend them, to educate them and defend Islam and to teach them and culture your children. So that taboo stuff needs to, that you need to work on yourself as well to get that out of your heart, what you need to say, and have these uncomfortable discussions. Unfortunately, the system is having that uncomfortable decision with your children, and it's not having a conversation. It's programming them. So it's the need of the time.
So, alhamdulillah, there's so many points to go into. I do want to keep going in this, but we really need to kind of keep the pace going as we move forward. But I think the segue to our next topic is very real, right? So we're talking about how it's a real struggle, and really for the Muslims in the West, the temperature is getting hot. It's getting harder to wear your hijab in certain countries. The agendas that promote LGBTQ, all these things that are clear cut, against our way of life are being pushed, to our children. And so that brings us to the second topic of discussion today. Okay, why not Hijra, right? This is an old idea that's sort of coming back again, right? That why not do Hijra or migrate to a place that's more suitable, perhaps in the Muslim world? Before we get into the theories of it, right? I was hoping, Brother Farhan, because we were talking a little bit before the talk, right? And you mentioned you're actually living in Bahrain, right? Could you just kind of, would you say you are someone that has practically fulfilled that idea that a lot of brothers have of Hijra? Perhaps could you speak to that?
So practically true with regards to what's right.
Would you say, like, in your personal experience, that you kind of have fulfilled that concept of Hijra that a lot of brothers kind of speak about in a way?
So, to be honest, it's a casual conversation. I don't think that was remotely on my mind when I made the decision about relocating to the Muslim world. No, everyone is driven by different objectives and motivations in the decisions that we take. If we think about it as a community, 3 generations back, there was probably hardly anyone from the Muslim community living here in the US. But then obviously grandparents, parents took an active decision to do, if I use your term hijrah, but to decide to move and relocate to the West. And that was driven primarily for economic considerations, etc. So I think everyone is driven by different issues as to which motivates them to look to move. And I think it's interesting because the dynamics is what we need to look at, i.e. what are the benefits of trying to relocate to the Muslim world, and which part of the Muslim world, and what are we trying to achieve? What are the drivers behind it that underpin these decisions? And it's not, as I say, it's not greener on the other side necessarily. The moment we hear the expression Muslim world, we automatically assume, therefore it must be better for a Muslim to relocate to the Muslim world because it is a Muslim world. So the challenges we're facing in the West, we will not be facing those challenges that we would find in the Muslim. The reality, actually, it could be worse.
Really?
And it can be far more difficult. Because you got to realize when we go with an identity, it's identity which you have to carry with you practically. And if I had to encapsulate it, it's a statement that I saw on social media. I'm not social media at all friendly, but I had the chance to look at something. And it said, it is bizarre in the Muslim world is where you have competitions weekly, annually, periodically, where you are rewarded and you are praised for reciting the Quran and memorizing the Quran. Competitions happen on a regular basis. And the statement was, you will be rewarded, you'll be praised for memorizing the Quran and reciting the Quran. But in the very same places, you'll be punished and penalized for wanting to implement the Quran. And this is the truth of the matter. So when we talk about these issues, about what is easy, it's all about what you want as a Muslim in terms of your life and your objectives. And these objectives, do they really marry and match up with what Islam wants in terms of objectives that we need to have and how we organize our lives? So when Allah says in the Quran, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ, that Allah created us to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we say, hey, you know, I'm going to make an active decision to relocate to the Muslim world in order to make my life more Islamic. Your immediate surrounding, what you may do, may be Islamic. But if the wider society is transitioning in the wrong direction, that responsibility still is upon our shoulders to remedy that situation. To isolate yourself as a Muslim in that community doesn't help at all, whether in the East or whether in the West. And there's a beautiful hadith, that narration, I'm sure all of us know, where the angels were commanded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to destroy this nation because of the violations they committed against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And they went to this community, about to destroy it, and what did they find? They found one man inside his house who was worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the angels returned back and say, Ya Allah, you commanded and we hear and we obey. You commanded us to destroy this community, but we found one man who worships you. And what was the reply of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Destroy him first. You would assume, save him and destroy everybody else. But destroy him first. Why? Because of all the corruption that was taking place, and he did nothing to change it or work to change it. So those who decide to leave and go to the Muslim world for the sake of protecting their family, and the reality is, as I say, nowadays, East and West is just words. One starts with a W, one starts with an E, but the reality is there's no East or West anymore. The value and the culture that we see predominant in the West is more or less what you will also now find in the East. And when we have that in mind, and I think the way we think of this discussion needs to be positioned and framed slightly differently.
No, Jazakallah khair. I don't think I can say it any more eloquently or beautiful than Brother Buddha.
I'll pay you after this,
No,
inshallah.
but what I can do is I can share you some stories. So, a year and a half or 2 years ago, I went to India and I spent 2 months with my brother-in-law and my sister-in-law, and I found that they're living the exact same lifestyle that we would be in America. Not in terms of like material, even, I'm not talking about material wealth. I'm talking about two parents working, kids coming home to, a house where, the parents are still to come home and they don't have time to cook dinner. Uber Eats, they have Ziggy and some other apps, Swiggy, and they order their food online and dinner comes home, it gets unboxed and you take out your plastic, fork and spoon and whatnot. And their dinner's on the table and then, the phones come out and the PS5, the PS PlayStation, it's all there. And it's the same exact lifestyle. This is in India. And I was thinking that, they don't, they're not exposed to this stuff like we are over here. They don't have but it's capitalism, and it's just on a different scale with different names, different, different foods, different flavors. It's, very similar when I was in the Hijaz, in Makkah and Medina. It was very similar. You could just pull out your phone and you can order stuff. You could, it's this mobile culture, mobile computing world that's. The whole world has adopted it. It's the same system. It has the same economic disparities that are over here. Today, over here, you have, I'm poor because I don't have a Bugatti. But, over there, it's, okay, I'm poor because I don't have a Samsung Galaxy S21. So it's different ratios, different levels, but it's the same disparity. It's the same culture. It's the same economics. It's the same political system. That's creating the same mechanisms, whether you're in India or you're in downtown Chicago. So
I want to push back a little bit, actually, to what both of you brothers have mentioned. I'm not saying necessarily disagree, but I mean a lot of brothers would advocate that what you're saying. There's obviously truth to it. With globalization, with spread of like liberalism, with like a unipolar world. Of course, there is this push to create a culture, spread the Western culture, or whatever you want to call it. However, the struggles, although there's struggles on both sides, the struggles are particular, right, in the West or the East, or would you guys argue that they are the same? Like Brother Burhan, you mentioned that the East and the West is really just words, right? This line has been blurred. Is there anything particular to the realities in each area, or would you kind of double down and say that no, it is actually the same?
No, Jazakallah. I mean, honestly, I would very much advocate the position, the argument is exactly the same. I think, if anything, I would argue potentially it's far more difficult in the East, in the Muslim world. And I'll give you a very simple way to look at it. And it's just me, I'm very black and white in this issue. So please feel free to throw some chappal at me if you disagree with me. I really don't mind, that's not a problem. But I'll give you the example. I mean, part of the reasons that we as a family relocated with my 7 children to the Muslim world is because we were homeschooling our children. And my wife, may Allah reward her immensely, took on that huge responsibility to teach all of our children at home. Because initially when they were at school, we realized no matter what kind of academic education they were receiving, something was far more important in terms of their education, which is their interactions with the wider society, the other children and their values and their principles and their language and the morality or absence of morality. And we realized that children were coming home with an identity which is a very confused identity. And we have a responsibility as Muslims to do what? To protect our children. Allah says this in the Quran, protect yourself and your family from what? From the hellfire. So we had this decision that, hold on, we're going to take our children out of school. This was in the UK. I'm not sure how it works in the US, so I can't speak on that behalf. And then obviously there comes a point when you become tired, exhausted of being able to carry on teaching 7 children at home. You're a housewife, you're a mother, you're a teacher, you're also one who wants to carry Islam in your discussions, and you're trying to juggle all of these responsibilities. And I'm the one who's taking the easy and just Jazakallah, carry on. And there comes a point when something has to give, and we realized actually this was not sustainable. And that was part of the reason why we decided to relocate to the Muslim world. And we entered our kids into an Islamic school. And after 3 months, we took them out because it was no different. In fact, it was worse. The language, the attitudes, the interaction of the kids. He said, you think you're going to Islamic school? Inside the school walls, as a parent, mashallah, I dropped my kids off at the entrance. Alhamdulillah, by the end of this, you'll become hafiz of Quran. Jazakallah khair. Jazakallah teacher for looking after my children. And within these 4 walls, you have no idea what they really learn. Because one is a class for 35, 40 minutes. And then what they have is interaction with the rest of the students and the rest of you is completely different. Our children were coming home worse than what they were coming home in the United Kingdom. So we took them out of school and we ended up homeschooling them in the Muslim world. Completely what we didn't expect to happen. We ended up homeschooling them until they were 16, 17 years old. So there is no distinction in that regard. Honestly, there isn't. And I feel why it's more dangerous is because something we have as a benefit in the West, which we don't have in the Muslim world. In the West, we can say to our children, Beta, Ibni, we don't do this because they are kuffar. They are non-Muslims and we don't like them. You can put that standard. You can make that distinction. But in the Muslim world, this is Fatima. How do I explain that to you? And this is Abdullah. Yeah, he shouldn't be doing what he's doing. But yes, he's a Muslim. And then it's blurred. It's like, Dad, if they can do it, why can't I do it? Here, at least you can say, because they're not Muslims. And we have a clear standard that tells us what we can do, what we can't do. And they don't have this standard. And we can make that distinction very, very clear. It's a challenge, but it's very, very clear to make the distinction. In the Muslim, where is that distinction? He's Abdullah and your son is Abdullah. Where's the distinction? He's declared the Shahada, your son's declared the Shahada. Where's that distinction to then say what they're doing is wrong? It's far more challenging in that regard. So I think it's all about perspective.
It definitely is more challenging. So I grew up here. I went to high school a few miles away. We weren't integrated the way the kids are integrated now. We had to deal with a lot of overt racism. I remember when I was in high school, my biology teacher, he asked for a graph of plant seed growth. So my dad's like, okay, Brito, I'll get you the professional engineering graph paper, and he gets it for me, and I do the whole project and I submit it, and my teacher takes it from me, and he goes, what is this? And I'm like, oh, that's the report. And he's like, well, why are you giving it to me? I'm like, you wanted this report, so I made this report. And he takes it and throws it on the ground in front of the whole class. And go pick it up. And keep in mind, I'm the only brown kid in the class, right? And I'm like, what's wrong? And now my face is red, super angry, being disrespected like that in class, right? Yeah, it was due tomorrow. We handed it in one day early. So I'm like, yeah, I thought that was a good thing. I thought that, I just handed in to you, And he's like, yeah, your job is to do what I tell you exactly, not more, not less. And he's embarrassing me in front of class. So I was so mad, I just stopped. I was normally like, I did well academically, but I was so mad at the whole system and just being ostracized and being demeaned like that, that I purposefully stopped doing all my homework. I paid attention in class. I learned what I needed to learn. I wasn't that, but I was going to protest by not doing anything. And I got straight F's. Straight F's. And when my dad got the report card, I thought it was a printing error. I thought that there was just one line, because an F was like a 1 on our report card. So he looks at me and goes, there's got to be a printing error there now. And I'm like, I don't know. It's like, well, what is this? It's just a line with some spaces in it. And I'm like, no, that's 6 1s, Dad. And he's like, what? And then it was lit. And I'm like, well, they're being racist in school and I can't do anything. And I told you, and you're not helping me. So this is my only way to protest. The kids don't have it like that today. They're protected. They're integrated. If that were to happen today, there'd be lawsuits. I get the congressman coming to my house, apologizing, and on national TV and make it a political brownie point for himself. So they're making our kids feel empowered, integrated, and giving them a sense of identity, and which we didn't have. So the game is even more dangerous. It's dangerous over there, it's dangerous over here. So it goes back to the same thing: parenting, understanding your Islam, interacting with the community, working with your Muslim communities, working with your imams, working with your scholars, all of that. It can't be just in the house. If you're going to teach just your kids and say, oh, I'm okay, then Burhan gave us the story of what happened with the guy who worshiped by himself, right? And the other thing that's going to happen is you're going to teach your children fear, because you're going to teach your children, hey, we implement this in the house, but we don't talk about it outside of the house. You don't need to be an activist, or you don't need to be a da'i, okay? You don't need to be, you don't need that attention. You're going to teach your children fear, and that's going to come back to bite. So,
okay,
it's holistic. It's very holistic.
no, alhamdulillah. We'll hold the questions till the end, brother, please. But I know amazing points. It is a matter of perspective, like you mentioned, and it really, like you guys mentioned, there's struggles on both sides, east and west. We had a topic, but in the interest of time, we're gonna maybe swap it out or leave it if we have time in the end. But what I really want you brothers to speak about is, okay, let's talk about the reality, right? It's about perspective, it's about awareness, it's about understanding, it's about east or west. The struggles don't change, or the struggles don't end. They just perhaps change forms. But practically speaking, what do we need to do in order to raise our kids and protect them? I mean, what is missing?
So if you do have the vision and you take these concepts and you take them home and you take them seriously, then what it means is you need to research, you need to learn, What does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say about tabarruj, about hijab? What is the actual commandment? Because the feminist is going to come and teach your kids, oh, why do you have to wear a scarf or a niqab? Because you're enticing men. So why does that become your burden? You have to get nuanced. You have to understand the arguments that are being programmed into your kids, and you have to learn what does Islam actually say, right? And you have to just say, what does your daughter, this is what Allah wants. This isn't about what a man wants. This is not about what society wants. This is not about what your father wants. This is about what Allah wants, and this is how you go to Jannah. And that has to be the aim of your family. And that's a very simple answer, but you have to get nuanced to it. How are they programming your kids? You have to go out and learn it. You have to learn and there's very good videos, inshallah, the podcast of the brother
Beyond the Ring.
Beyond.
You're talking about Wahid Jensen?
The older brother, he did I think it's called Thought Blog Podcast. But there's a plethora, a rich discussion on YouTube from Muslims that are good, thought out discussions, presentations that actually, for the people who are not aware, they go back all the way from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, how he separated identity and sexual orientation, and how that manifested into what we have today. He goes out back 400 years and he goes through the whole history of the liberalization of the mind, the corruption of the mind, and to what we have today and how we address it. So there's a lot of good, rich resources. You got to spend the time, and instead of you got to sacrifice the parties, the biryani with the family, and whatever it is. Sometimes you gotta sacrifice certain things, and you gotta focus on how to deprogram your kid, how to talk to them, and work on yourself to break those taboos.
Jazakallah khair. Alhamdulillah, Arfan talked very much about the output. This is what we would want as the ideal standard in terms of the engagement interaction of parents with their children. Let me just quickly talk about the input, what I consider what predicates all of this, which is ownership. So let me put an initial disclaimer, because I'm looking at one person in particular. Allah reward those who invest their time, their effort, and sacrifice.
Amen.
By setting up, for example, a Saturday school or a weekend Islamic school to provide for the community. But the ownership for the children doesn't belong to the masjid. It doesn't belong to the Saturday school. The ownership of the children belongs to the parents. So the most fundamental thing that what we need to recognize in this whole dynamic that we're discussing is the first thing we need to have as parents is a concept that we have the ownership for our children, that we are the ones who are directly responsible and accountable for what the children do, what they don't do. It's an easy option to push them onto the masjid, to push them onto a Saturday school and get this masjid and this school to take on that responsibility, which myself as a parent, I could be failing. So the first notion is, as parents, we need to own and have that ownership for our children. Point number one. Point number two is, as parents, we need to be a role model. It can't be the case that everybody else is a role model, but I'm not a role model. Son, spend more time with this person, spend more time with that person, daughter, spend more time with this sister, spend more time with that auntie. Why am I not the role model for my children? And we have to be the role model as a parent. Third point is time. And we don't have enough time. Life has become busy for all of us as parents. And the discussion isn't about the amount of time, because how often do we spend with our children or vice versa? And most of the time, we're actually looking at our mobile phones. It's not the quantity of time, it's the quality of time. You could have a father-son relationship in terms of, okay, I'm going to commit to give my son time because that's what I need to do as a good father. And for 2 hours, you're just looking at him, he's looking at you, and then the remaining 1 hour, 50 minutes, you're looking at your mobile phone. You may be communicating, Dad, let me text you what I'm going to say. Let me WhatsApp you. Yeah.
LOL.
And what really matters is not the quantity of time, but it's the quality of time. And these three elements for me are not the only thing, but these are principal foundations, which then leads to the output, which what Ahmed was talking about, which is very good. It's just how should be galvanized in terms of the awareness that we have, and how awareness, what's going on, should be passed on to our children, but we have to have ownership for that as parents.
Just as a follow-up thought to what Brother Burhan said about ownership, that is also under attack. Toxic masculinity, masculinity, the whole concept of being, a lion, the one who's in charge of the house, the one who looks out for the woman, protector, maintainer of the woman. That concept is under attack. So if you don't build back to the Quran and Sunnah for your thoughts and ideas as the basis of your actions, then the attempts that you take to correct the incorrect beliefs, they're being addressed by the system. So now, if a 12-year-old girl says, "Oh, my dad's trying to talk to me about he's just being toxic masculine," I don't have to listen to it. He just pays for my stuff, so I can put up with it till I'm 18. So really establishing the fear of Allah, the hope for Jannah is the vital basic core that every single family, every Muslim needs to hold on to.
Jazakallah khair. I think both you, Brother Irfan and Brother Burhan, mentioned amazing points, especially in terms of the parents in the audience. And really, the words you say as a parent, stick with your child. I mean, obviously, we have parents and they stick. One thing I would like to ask, though, is that although amazing advice, one thing that's kind of stuck in my head, especially as we're having this discussion, is that you can be the best parent. You can do all the things right. And sometimes it still doesn't work out. And of course, there's the qadr of Allah, right? But what I'm trying to get at is, especially Brother Burhan, as you were explaining in your sort of journey as you travel around the Muslim world, right? You guys initially started homeschooling, and mashallah, with 7 kids, it's something that becomes overbearing. Something that becomes very difficult. So how much is it of an onus of just parents, and how much of it is it that we're missing the village, so to speak?
So we're missing the what's right?
We're missing the village, so to speak. As the expression goes, that it takes a village to raise a child. Because at the end of the day, like the village or the society or whatever does the job, right? I mean, you can be like so. What I'm trying to say is that, of course, Allah SWT doesn't expect us to be like superheroes or like to be like, nothing gets us tired and nothing gets us weak, and we will individually solve all these problems. But the reality is that we do get tired. We are limited, and you can be the sheikh and you can be the scholar and mashallah, but what are we missing beyond that?
No, Jazakallah. First point is that, alhamdulillah, it's a good reminder that we can do everything right as a parent, and still we don't see the result in terms of our children. For sure, this is something which is not in our control. But that shouldn't be something which stigmatizes us. On the contrary, we have the responsibility and the ownership. At the end of the day, our duty is to make the effort. All results are from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And at the end of the day, alhamdulillah, this is the infinite wisdom and mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that He doesn't judge us by the results. Whereas in life, and particularly in the secular Western framework, we're judged by results. That's what matters. Responsibility to make the effort to the best that we can as parents in terms of what we impart, in terms of knowledge, understanding, the love, the commitment, the relationships. But the second point is also very, very true. There's only so much you can do, and you're working against a tide which is very, very strong. And that's the tide of the society and the values which exist, which dominate, which dictate in and around what we do as a family. And for sure, in that regard, we talked about earlier on, the very first subject was about the kind of challenges we're facing subject by subject in this regard of the LGBT. That's just an aspect of looking at the challenges we face in any society. And actually, at the end of the day, what we need to look at from a societal level, what needs to change. And that's a broader conversation with regards to, in as much as I need to focus on my family, I know that part of what will protect my family is by having a society which is in sync with the values I want to impart to my family. If they're not synced, and they're not, then what dominates won't be my values. What will dominate will be the values in the society. Again, if I had to give another analogy, which I heard from an imam who was giving the khutbah, he said, as a Muslim, we Muslims, we are like a fish. And obviously sitting in the audience, and I don't like seafood at all, I'm thinking that's not a really good analogy to start with. But let me hear what he has to say. Because we as Muslims, we're like a fish. And so that no one could say, Imam said, what does that mean? Because you're khutbah, you have to listen to what he had to say. And he went and carried on with this analogy and said, look, when you take a fish out of water, what happens to the fish? It starts to struggle. It starts to wriggle frantically because it can't breathe. Why can't it breathe? Because its natural environment is in the sea. And what it tries to do, it makes every effort to go back into the water, its natural environment. That is exactly what we are as a Muslim and as an ummah. Our natural environment is the sea of Islam. And there is no sea of Islam anywhere in the world today. And the moment you take a fish out of water, it can't breathe, it struggles. And the moment you take a Muslim out of the sea of Islam, somehow we learn to adapt. But what we're adapting to is not Islam. Rather, we're adapting Islam to a reality when the purpose of Islam is to change the reality, meaning we should be struggling to go back into the sea of Islam, but that is not what we've done. We've tried to adapt into the reality, and as a result of that, the values that we wanted to subscribe to are no longer the values by default, rather the values of the society are dictating and dominating over us. And in that regard, very, very true. It takes a village very much, it takes a community, it takes a society to bring the kind of change that we need. So it's not enough to think I'm done enough by looking after my children, by taking them to another part of the world and trying to give them an Islamic environment and background. It's not enough, because what still matters is the society and the values in the society which dictate, which dominate, which influence more than what I could do as a parent.
I don't have any.
Okay.
So we're gonna move on.
Yeah, so we have two, this kind of links back to the topic we skipped, and I think if we can cover it quick, we perhaps can cover it. So to be, this kind of leads into the topic of culture, right? And I think to kind of visit the scene of dawah, right? Especially in the Muslim community, amongst, you could say, quote unquote practicing Muslims. Obviously dawah goes through stages and things that are popular and whatnot. So for example, particularly in the 90s, there was a lot of sloganism. For example, that there's an inherent clash between culture and Islam. And so what I want to ask is what is the link between culture and Islam, and particularly in the context of maintaining Islamic values? And if that's not clear, I can definitely clarify. But
well, to be honest, this is all about semantics. It's all about definitions. It's how we define culture. We have something, we say Islamic culture, and then we have culture, and then we have tradition, and then we have Asian culture, we have Arab culture. I think this is, in part, we need to be very crystal clear about what we mean by culture, because in conversations, we can come across as being very offensive and say, astaghfirullah, brother, we don't accept this kind of culture. And then first is to understand what do we mean by culture. And that would be the starting point of the conversation for me. Very simply put, culture itself, in a very loose sense, is not an issue as long as it meets the most basic requirement, which is that it is consistent and compatible and is based upon the fact that Islam accepts and recognizes it. This is, for me, is the basis. And as long as the culture in Islam can be seen as something which is halal, then we're okay, we're good to go. But the moment that action and that activity, whatever that practice is, then starts to violate the principles of Islam, then it's not valid, irrespective where the culture originated from, whether it was from the West or whether it was from the East. So for example, maybe it still exists in part of the Indian subcontinent. If the dowry, if the mahar is given from the woman's family to the man's family, and that is culture, well, that is wrong. Because the mahar is from the man to the woman, not the other way around, although we might want that to be the case. Or both go, yeah, inshallah, inshallah. But the reality is the mahar is from the man to the woman. It's not the other way around. Now that culture is a culture, but this culture is fundamentally in contradiction to Islam. We cannot accept it, we can't tolerate it. We will reject it completely. Whereas culturally, alhamdulillah, those from the Indian subcontinent were shalwar kameez. And those in the Arab world were thobes. And those in Africa, no idea what they were, but they were something. But this is culture. But alhamdulillah, this is something which Islam accepts, acknowledges, recognizes, because the aura is covered, etc., etc. Not a problem. So I think it's all about distinguishing between what we define by culture and just asking the very most basic question, which is this activity, is this action, is this practice consistent with Islam or not? And if it's halal, then the term, I'm sure, guys, is legit. And if it's not Islamically accepted, it's not legit. And we just won't give it any credence to it. Now, the challenge for us as a Muslim and as a community is that when we're growing up, that we don't have a single reference point for our culture. That is our challenge. You think at the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the time of the Sahaba, may be pleased with them, and then the Tabi'in, the Tabi'in, there was only one culture which was a reference for them. So they threw out, during the first 13 years of struggle, all that was kufr in their foundations. And that was a struggle that the Prophet ﷺ engaged with the Sahaba to change the principles of society. And Allah gave them the authority in Medina by establishing Islam as a deen. And anyone who was born and grew up in that environment, the only culture they had was Islam. That was the foundation. That's what they lived, breathed. That was the sea of Islam. Today, when we grow up, we have a confused personality because our foundation is not single, it's multiple. It's Western culture, it's Eastern culture, and then it's Islamic culture. And the three don't meet. They're very distinct. And while the Western culture can tolerate Eastern culture, and it can tolerate aspects of Islamic culture, Islamic culture can't tolerate Western culture. It can't tolerate Eastern culture, which obviously is in contradiction to Islam. So in growing up, it's like, how do we evaluate my identity, my personality? I want to get married. I know this requires for there to be nikah. Then tick, Islamic culture. The actual ceremony that takes place in the marriage process tends to be based upon Hindu traditions. This is not Islamic culture. This is Asian culture. But the lifestyle I want to live is that my wife will be working, she's the career woman, and she doesn't need to look after the kids. And now we start looking at Western culture. What are my aspirations? And when you have an individual growing up in that environment, when you have a family building its life around these principles where there's an obvious clash, it creates that confusion, it creates that challenge. And subhanAllah, as a family, we struggle because the aspirations are built around trying to identify which one of these cultures should dominate my life, which is the most important one. And that creates a lot of issues within the family, within the community as well. So I think when we talk about the clash of culture, as long as the culture we're talking about is defined very clearly, it is aligned to Islamic culture, which is our foundation, or it is in contradiction, and then we have to work through that accordingly.
So I'd like to, because I remember the argument that a particular brother is making, just to add a little bit of context here. And Jazakallah for that clarification. And just to add on to it, right? It's the fact that, or the fact that to say that that we do not adopt any culture is inherently like a fallacy, because the way Allah SWT designed the human being is they're not atomized. They're not atomized structure with but with collectivistic attributes, with the need for interdependencies. to be dependent on each other, to build relationships which are dependent on each other, to build societies that are co-functional with each other. And so inherently, the idea that culture must be removed does not actually remove culture, but it forces the human being to adopt something else to fill that void. And so the argument was, and perhaps this can give clarifications, is that practically speaking, of course, we look at the reality. We see, okay, what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger say about this matter, and we judge upon it. But practically speaking, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created people differently, right? Different levels of insight and awareness and sensitivity, and so the argument is that what is safer practically for the Muslim community? Is it number one, to abandon culture and haphazardly build or negotiate culture, or two, or is it safer theoretically to adopt certain cultures that have been in a conversation or have been shaped with Islam through centuries and maybe 1,000 years or so? And perhaps okay, go on.
No, wallahi, jazakallah khair for that quite elaborate explanation. I think it's not either one. Simply, Islam is a yardstick, make that the measure. And we measure our culture by that foundation. If it's consistent with Islam, jazakallah khair. If it's not consistent with Islam, ma salama, we're not interested. And as a community, as a family, that is simply it. I think it's not about accepting or rejecting, it's about having the right basis to evaluate.
I'm going to give an example of what he's talking about. How I related to his conceptual question was, when my grandma died, I spoke to my chacha, or my uncle, my father's younger brother, and I asked him, can you tell me how she passed away? And he was like, she wasn't waking up, and then she started taking heavy breaths, and she was passing away. So I just started reading Surah Yasin. So I'm like, okay, that's interesting. After he says the whole story, I'm like, hang on. Why were you reading Surah Yasin? And he's like, I just know that's the thing to do. I just know that's the thing to do. It was mentioned by some other uncle. I'm like, do you know there's an actual hadith for that? And I had once read that hadith vaguely in my studies, but he just knew it just from a cult, a subjective sense of the word culture. He just knew it that's what elders did. When a person's dying, you read Yasin. Now, that was 5 years ago. If you go back to my grandma's time, my grandma, she gave bayah to Sultan Abdul Hamid. Okay, she had a different culture, right? And what I'm getting at is that the farther you go away from the state, right, from the Islamic way of life, the Khilafah state that we once had as Muslims, right, you see that culture it degrades slowly, where you have one generation, and then you have another generation, and you have another generation, and now it's like, oh, I didn't even know that was part of Islam. So when you have the Islamic way of life, what we're calling for, what we want to resume, and what we want to work for, not everybody's a scholar. Not the Ummah is not a scholar, but you see the whole system of Islam. You see the emanation of ilm. You see the manifestation of ilm practically on the ground. So you might not know the hadith for that ordinance, but you know it's part of Islam, and that gets woven into your sense of culture, your sense of being, your sensitivities, right? So you become sensitive to how a person dresses. You become sensitive to how a person speaks. And you start forming this word culture, this Islamic culture, right? And it's just a different take, because it's such a subjective word, the word culture. It's the way that, without that Islamic way of life, without that state, you lose that culture very fast. So that's all.
Brother, we have to keep the comments a little bit short, just because we're at the interest of time. There's so much discussed. Amazing discussion so far. We just want to hit one last topic, and then we'll switch over to Q&A. And we'll try to keep this as brief as possible. So the last thing we just want to touch on very quickly is, okay, so we started off with the protests in Dearborn. We talked about, the agendas that are happening. We talked about East versus West. We talked about, our kids' culture. So that kind of relates back to take it all the way back, in terms of how much we've sort of traveled around the world, so to speak, to the topic of activism again, right? So Muslims are protesting, Muslims are raising their voice, from Dearborn to, all the way to, Dubai or other places in the Muslim world. So really briefly, I want to just ask, for the brothers, mashallah, that have traveled, that have knowledge in the Muslim world, what are number one, what are the Muslims thinking about, and number two, what do they need to be thinking about? What do they need to hold in importance?
So, well, you're in Dubai, so. So my most recent travels, I find, the kids in the Muslim world, they're experiencing the same thing as the Muslim kids over here are experiencing. If you look at the concentrated effort from the governments to bring in Western culture and, Western influences, music, media, TV, satellite, all of that into Saudi, and you have, Salman Khan, you got Bollywood being imported there, you have mumble rappers being imported to the deserts of Riyadh and Jeddah. It's, and, there's friend circles, half the friends want to go, half the friends don't. There's girls that are going, these are all the same dynamics that are playing out all over the Muslim world. And, all of that has to, it is connected politically, it is connected to IMF loans, it is connected to economic policies, it's connected to technology sharing. All of these things are interwoven. Then that means that the solution has to be comprehensive, and it has to be from Islam as well, right? So it has to be the right solution from the Aqidah, right? So all of it is connected, and all of it has a holistic solution.
It's the matrix.
What I'd say is that the love of Islam is growing. The love that the Ummah has for Islam is growing. It's very evident wherever you go. You can see this in the numbers that, for example, simply attend the masajid. In my day and age, when I was slightly younger, I'm still only 20, but when I was a lot younger, don't laugh. But alhamdulillah, it was very difficult to find the youth inside the masjid. It was very difficult to find the youth who had an interest in Islam, would make an effort to even learn tajweed or learn hifz. Now the youth are planning, arranging finances to travel to the Muslim world to learn hifz, to learn tajweed, to learn usul al-fiqh, spending months, if not years, to get those qualifications. Now we see the masajid are brimming with the presence of youth more than ever before. We see the recent events of the last 2 to 3 years where announcements were made about Islam and the Muslims responded. The sentiment and the love of Islam is undeniable and is growing. The issue is the disconnect between the sentiment and the thinking. What are the resulting actions that we take as a result of this sentiment? And the concept for me is very simple. If we have a sentiment, a love of Islam, but it's not directed in how it needs to be presented, then our sentiment gets hijacked and we get redirected in how we display the sentiment in some of the activities and some of the activism that we start to engage in, which goes in the line of, we need to go to our politicians, we need to participate in the political process, we need to, all these things become, and that's not because of a deviation from Islam. They believe this is how they translate their love of Islam in terms of trying to do the best for their community. And I think that is a challenge that we face today. While the love of Islam grows undeniably, what we need to focus upon is, are we being directed by the correct and the right thoughts and the concepts of Islam in order to have the view on how we solve our problems comprehensively and fundamentally? So,
Jazakallah khair. One last question, then we're going to switch it to the Q&A, just very briefly. So, Jazakallah khair for both speakers. But okay, can as brothers ask, okay, well, can you be direct with us? So what is the correct idea? What is in terms of our activism, what should we be focused on? You know, of course, as you brothers mentioned, there's distractions, and then there's things that we should be thinking about.
Are you, in terms of kids? What the kids should be thinking about, what the parents should be thinking about, what just activism in general?
In general.
Here? You know, first thing, pick up the books of Sunnah. Read your Sirah. Read, you know, the plentiful Sirah books that are out there, and educate yourself, research, understand Islam, understand what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from you. Read the classical works of Tafsir, get a knowledge. You can't sit there and be an activist without the knowledge. You know, how are you going to measure what's right and wrong? Before you're going around measuring what's right and wrong, you're measuring which causes to support, what not to support, how to not get played in this game. First, understand your base, understand your beliefs, understand the Quran, understand what Allah wants from you, and then now gauge yourself on that spectrum. Where am I, and where do I need to go? What do I need to attack? What are we being targeted with? And then you can formulate a proper response and have a proper strategy and tackle the right issues.
Can I just make one point, because we definitely want to move on, and I don't want to digress on what's been mentioned already. Knowledge and the depth of knowledge is only as useful, is only as meaningful based upon what is your objective. And what is critically important in terms of awareness is to have the right framework in order then to identify what knowledge do I really need to acquire. Otherwise, we have lots of Muslims around the world who have subhanAllah knowledge that I would die for. I would love to sit at their feet as long as they're wearing socks. I would love to sit by their feet and inshallah gain as much knowledge as I can from them. But the reality is that the knowledge that's going to benefit not just me, but benefit the ummah in terms of where we need to be. So fundamentally, the knowledge needs to be predicated upon a framework, and the framework should be, how do I understand Islam? If I've understood Islam as a deen, as something which is comprehensive, that will direct the knowledge that I need and the gaps that I need to plug with regards to what I need to be as an activist, as a parent, as a family, as a community. Because then my objective is very, very clear. I need to bring Islam back as a deen, something comprehensive. If I don't have that as my foundation, I can dive into knowledge in terms of aqeedah, I can dive into knowledge in terms of akhlaq, I can dive into knowledge on the fiqh of salah, but I've missed the knowledge that is needed, and that can only come if I'm predicated upon the right view of what Islam is. And unless we have that as a starting point, then the knowledge we gain, though we gain reward for it, is not achieving what we need to achieve in terms of our objectives.
Purpose and perspective. So if you understand your purpose, then you'll form the right perspective, and that knowledge will be beneficial.
Okay. Jazakallah khair. We have to cut it there for now. Jazakallah khair for joining us, but we will now proceed to the Q&A section. So I know there's a lot of amazing topics, and I think the brothers did phenomenal. But now the floor is open, inshallah. And we're going to be recording this, inshallah. So this will be live streamed as well.
Was that to discourage people from asking questions, isn't it?
Yes, brother, please.
It's actually a question about the little chat asked. He's wondering, what can kids do themselves to stay away from consumption? I guess it's one of the.
And if you could please repeat the question.
What do the youth or the younger kids, what do they need to do to stay away from the corruption, from the things which are wrong? Well, Jazakallah khair, I think it's a huge challenge, just because this is a reality that we can't avoid in terms of the environment that we live in today, and all of us exposed. The dust of haram is covered everywhere, and it's very difficult to navigate and avoid that dust being attached to your clothing, and it becomes part of you, unfortunately. There's a hadith of Rasulullah who said, "Al-maru ala dini khalil." A person is upon the deen of his friends. فَلْيَنْظُرْ. So you should be watching and seeing who are the friends that we have. So if I had to just summarize it, I always say that there's three things to this. One is to try to change. One is to have sincerity. That I have a desire to go in the right direction. Sincerity is a fundamental principle that would guide all of us, and then say, hey, I need to be sincere in what I want to do. That's going to be the starting point. Meaning it's not just because I want to be with people, but the driver is I want to change my situation because sincerely, I want to get close to Islam. I want to get close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Secondly is obviously to have the right people around you. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, keep in mind, a lot of the companions, a lot of the Sahaba were young. From the age of 8 all the way up to 20, predominantly they were young. But what gave them the huge advantage, besides obviously the presence of the greatest of creation, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they had a bond that they built amongst themselves, within themselves and towards themselves. So the second thing is, as youth, we need to have that environment of having the right friends that will push us in the right direction, that will be there for us, look after our backs, make sure that we're on the right path, all these kind of standard lines that we hear into the discussion, make sure we have the right people around us. The third thing is, I use the term repetition. A classic example is in the month of Ramadan. The first day of fasting is very, very difficult. It's not easy because the body isn't accustomed to abstaining from food for such a long time. But by the 10th, 11th, 12th day, the body has adjusted. Fasting becomes very, very easy because we were repetitive in the action that we performed. So part of what we need to do as youth is start to develop and be repetitive in the good action. And that comes in the environment that we have, that comes in the sincerity that we have, that we start looking at the right actions that we should do and do them on a repetitive basis such that it becomes part of our personality. And that then inshallah will push us in that right direction.
Okay. I'm going to answer in a completely different spectrum. Right now, as kids, and absolutely what Burhan said is absolutely true and is the right basis. One of the most important things that I've noticed as kids and as parents, and everybody knows this, protect your social media profile, your algorithm, as like with dhikr. If you look at one haram thing, you're going to be fed on your smartphone with advertisements, with all of that, right? With all the fahisha. This is like just a practical nasiha I can give you. Protect that AI algorithm that is on you. Protect it. Staying away. Understand that the 1 second of fitna that you might glance at is going to turn into 200 minutes more of being bombarded by that satanic stuff. So this is just the most fundamental, basic thing. I'm not going to try to be fancy about this or anything. I'm sorry, I don't mean to use that word fancy, but I'm just going to be really practical, really real, really just understand that every time you're holding your mobile phone, there is a plan that is being planned out for you. There's an agenda being created for you, a programming guide that is being created for you. Every second you use for good will add you to good algorithms and good search results. And every second that's bad is gonna, enter you into a new type of algorithm program that's gonna say, oh, well, let's test out this content on that content. Keep that in mind because that's never going away. That's just the reality of the world.
Yeah, question, please.
I'm a younger brother, so I can't answer that question.
I'm a younger brother too.
Can you repeat the question?
So do you mean like as an older brother, like practically, like or ideas and beliefs wise, or like real actions you can take? My most powerful motivation is, and the most powerful motivation that I understand.
Could you repeat the question?
How can we spark motivation in our siblings, correct, to be on Sirat al-Mustaqim? The most powerful motivations that I feel that drive me as a human being And I think I understand from the Quran as well, our hope and fear, iman, hope for the good and fear the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Center your discussions around this. Wouldn't this be great in Jannah? In doing that, I would fear the punishment of Allah. Centering your conversations around the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, around hope in Him, hope in His reward, and fear of His punishment. Learning about hell will make you fear hell. So, like, how many people here know what Jahannam means? Can I get a show of hands? The word Jahannam. Okay, what does Jahannam mean? The word Jahannam. Well, not really, but it was a trash pit next to Jerusalem. Okay, it was a trash pit where all the Yahud would, Bani Israel would burn their trash. It was called the like you could say like the little valley of Jahannam. It was just the name of it. And that word was the word adopted where the trash is burned, right? Where the trash is burned, that was the Hebrewite word for that, where the word Jahannam was, it's called the Yohenheim or something in Hebrew, okay? And I'm just going into the etymology, but the etymology of itself is so scary, right? Reflect on the ayat, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us about, the zakum and repeat these ayat and build those motivations.
I'm going to do something which, alhamdulillah, I found to be being very practical, very unlike me. Normally it's very theoretical, but be practical. One is bring your siblings into your orbit. Into your orbit. So what you're doing, your environment, your reality, you bring them into your orbit. So they're not being captivated and being pulled away into what they're doing. You bring them into your orbit. Point number two is a practical point. I learned that from just personal experience. My elder brother tried very hard to bring me into Islam many, many years ago, and he failed miserably. Why? Because he's my brother. I never listened to my brother. Siblings are siblings. So one thing is the recognition that maybe I'm not the best person to bring my son, or to bring my brother, to bring my sister into the environment. Maybe I need to ask some of my friends. Meaning part of the thinking should be all about, I need to bring them into the right environment. I need to bring them into the right orbit. I know what I need to do, but am I the right person to do it? Just because of the historical sibling relationship rivalry that's developed over time. Maybe I'm not the right person, maybe, but I need to get somebody else to do that for me on my behalf. But you take central responsibility for that.
Wallahi, what he said is exactly why I went and changed my life around. My brother tried, he's like, Irfan, what's the difference between being a billionaire and going to Jannah? And I would think I was like 17 at the time, long hair, and I didn't care. So I'm like, I don't know. And he's like, Jannah is forever, and being a billionaire is temporary. I'm like, oh, okay, that's good to know. All right, I'm gonna go rock on. And then he started bringing his friends along, and I started hanging out with his friends. And now when his friends said this stuff, and it made me start thinking, who is Allah and this and that, that's how I got my reboot, So what he said, I am a living example of what Brother Burhan just said.
So another question is directed at the speakers. I just want to add one thing, because I was a big brother growing up, and definitely the rivalry is there. But I really want to double down on what they said, in the sense that, in the culture we live in, like, everyone's an individual, and I have my friends, and my brother has his friends, and they have their things, and we have our things. Practically speaking, as a brother said, like, share friends, sharing friends, sharing community. So you're within that circle of influence, and you must maintain that. And one other very small thing I'll say, very practically speaking, is that, even if sometimes you have to, especially as someone that's older, but it doesn't matter. So even Umar ibn al-Khattab was the second, right? Not necessarily the oldest, but particularly as the oldest, like, you cannot allow in your presence a certain conversations happen, right? And I mean that's part of your surrounding, right? Like you cannot allow certain things to happen, and that creates a culture. Right?
knowledge. Says it's a deep area, but it doesn't refer to the area of that's
Oh, you know, I can look at, like, oh, absolutely.
Arabic sources, Wikipedia, I can go and write what I want. Everybody knows that. And it's even known in the research, the whole research community. You put Wikipedia in your paper.
No, Jazakallah. There's some Hebrew words for it that I had researched and I can share it, inshallah. Yeah. That's, yeah. Yeah.
With the prophets, they were coming as well, to someone. Punishment were to go. So whatever the word that was used, the Prophet used, for them, whatever it is, for us, the from a Islamic perspective, it means.
No, Jazakallah khair. I was right. Right. From the Sharia, we follow the Sharia definition and the Sharia word. This what I was mentioning was just etymological. It was just some historical connections to it, but that was disgusting enough for me to just reflect on. But we followed the Islamic understanding of the word. Yes, absolutely.
Question.
I'm wondering, what are some like practical keys for like homeschooling? What are some things what are some structures that you put in place for a successful homeschooling? I mean, I think homeschooling is good. I just wonder how does one build those social skills that a typical school environment would get, so that he didn't get that.
Have a good wife. That'll be the starting point. So the question is all about what are some of the things we should consider in terms of developing a very good, solid homeschooling environment. Particularly one of the biggest drawbacks, actually, Jazakallah, very profound, and you made that connection very, very quickly, is that one of the biggest drawbacks is the social interaction, the social skills are going to be very challenging because you don't become streetwise by being homeschooled. And there's many things which happen practically in society that we need to be aware of. Simply in terms of, we started the road, we need to walk upon all these things, which are very basic things. Things get lost because you get tied up in that environment, just becoming homeschooled. So I say there's probably three elements. One is a very fundamental principle, which is one of discipline. One thing which is always missing within homeschool environment, because you're at home, it's your bedroom, it's the dining table, it's mum or it's dad. The idea of being disciplined goes out of the window because you've become very relaxed. And even because of other responsibilities and commitments, cooking, cleaning, washing, shopping, sometimes the timetable can switch and move around. That really doesn't help, because one thing we know in life is that we need to have discipline. And one of the challenges which is faced is how we maintain discipline as a concept and practically within homeschool environments. That's one thing to, as a principle, how we maintain the issue of discipline. Number two, obviously, becomes the issue of the curriculum. The curriculum needs to be comprehensive, needs to cover all the subjects which you need to do in order to pass, to get on to moving on to college or university. You need to follow a curriculum, but obviously it's sanitized to be sure that it covers what we need to cover. But at the same time, it meets the requirements to be able to go and progress in life. So for example, my children went on to university, went on to because we had to make sure we model our curriculum to fit within that framework. So you've got to keep that in mind. And thirdly, it's the social relationships that we want to develop that we know we're going to struggle with. We then make a proactive effort to make sure that the environment that the children grew up in is an environment which is one of interaction. So we always were very mindful to make sure they had that interaction with the broader society. And obviously the broader society in that regards was still always Muslims. That at least laid a foundation for them to understand some of the mannerisms, some of the behaviors, some of the, the idiosyncrasies or nuances that exist in society, and that all help to contribute towards it. But still, there is a bit of an adjustment that needs to be made. And I do very much recognize that point, that the social interaction with society that we naturally get schooling is not the same that you get through homeschooling. And that's probably, for me, the only advantage that exists is how we just plug that gap but it can be applied. It just requires a bit more effort, a bit more thought. But Jazakallah, it's a very good thing that you've identified.
A majority of my family homeschools. My sister homeschools, my brother homeschools. I used to homeschool until those same forces just being able to put in the time to develop a curriculum and all of that just was getting past me as the academic level was raised higher and higher. So I would agree with Burhan, Brother Burhan, that the same challenges I face with the social interaction, you have to put in an extra level of effort to get that social engagement, social interaction, and your kids might backfire if you don't. If you think you're gonna, you have to judge the nature of your kids. Are they reclusive types that really, they're introspective and they really require that interaction to have a fulfilling satisfaction of self or sense of self, then you might be okay. But if they're very outgoing and they might start rebelling and they might start acting out and not complying and following the curriculum and that you have laid out for them. So it takes a sense of understanding your kids and tailoring it. So there's things called homeschool co-ops that you can go out on. There's Muslim co-ops, there's homeschool Muslim co-ops. There's many of these. You're gonna have to go out and find them. They're on Facebook, they're on Reddit. These boards exist. Go out, find these, and tailor something for your children if they need it.
Question?
This question stems from the initial way I started the discussion on the Dearborn protest. I was wondering, is it okay or is it a smart political move to stand alongside non-Muslims to protest something like that? My understanding is Muslims protesting with Christians to protest whatever the school was. So is this something okay to do? Is it what is it done? And what is it smart political move to do?
So, Jazakallah khair, interesting. One is a political action that we want to
Sorry,
take.
could you just repeat that?
Sorry. In terms of the initial subject that was discussed with regards to the LGBT issue and the Dearborn community, how they're responding, and the questions are all about, can we stand alongside other communities, faith communities, whether Christians or others, unified against this introduction of LGBT? For me, the principle is just very simple, that we stand upon Islam and we present Islam. And therefore, it's got to be very, very clear that anything we work and cooperate with any organization is based upon the banner of Islam. And therefore, it's very clear. So for me, it's not about whether you're standing alongside a Christian or alongside even an atheist or alongside even a Jew or anybody else to speak against what's going on. It's what is the banner that you're representing. And that's the critical thing, meaning they should come under your banner. And as long as they're standing under your banner, then you're all good and well. The moment you stand under their banner, it means you've compromised upon principles because you're putting them as a standard with regards to what is not acceptable. And we don't have this policy of, because it's an agreement with what we want, therefore it's okay to do. And there's a principle in Islam that whatever disagrees with Islam is haram. And whatever agrees with Islam is also haram, unless the basis is built upon and we establish and we accept it is because Islam permits it. Simply because they do something similar, it's a bit like saying a dog has 4 legs, a table has 4 legs. It doesn't mean they're the same. They're not the same at all. So those similarities still has that distinction that we need to be very, very wary about. And that principle is very important. So we stand under the banner of Islam, and anybody who wants to join us on that platform, thank you very much. But we will never work on the platform of somebody else.
Yeah, Jazakallah khair. We saw this a lot with the immigration ban, right? With a lot of faith-based community leaders who were walking under the same banner, and it confused a lot of people's beliefs and it confused a lot of people's aqidah. So you're not just, you might get politically diverted, or your agenda might become the agenda of somebody else, and you're going to misguide your own community and your own people. So that is something very dangerous.
Any other questions? If not, inshallah, we can kind of wrap it up here. Jazakallah khair again for coming out today, this Friday, and for sticking through this whole thing. And a big, Jazakallah khair to Brother Burhan and Brother Irfan. Amazing discussion and something we need more and more in our community. And inshallah, join us next week for another very special and inshallah interesting session. Any last words from Brother Burhan and Brother Irfan?
No, Jazakallah for me, fine, alhamdulillah.
No, Jazakallah khair. I really hope we didn't bore you to death. And forgive us if we did.